Hi everybody, I'm Michaela Schick, and this is my presentation for EDL 851, my case study, A Good Teacher Turns Bad. My first category is the problem identification and analysis. So first I'm going to talk about what we know about the case. So we know information about Crestview Elementary School. It's a rural school, seems to have a good reputation, good student outcomes. And we also know about the school personnel. We know that Mrs. Wilson is the principal, and she's in her third year of being principal there. And we know that Mrs. Horton is a veteran teacher there. She's been a Teacher of the Year of the district. And we also know that she had a tough ending to the past year. She has had a lot of personal trouble going on at home, and it's affecting her work. She's had issues with other teachers and students. She's been argumentative and combative, and now parents are complaining that she's verbally abusive to students during school. Mr. Stafford is a parent who had a complaint about Mrs. Horton, and he set up a meeting with the principal and Mrs. Horton, and the meeting did not go well and ended with Mrs. Horton yelling at the parent and the meeting abruptly being brought to an end by Mrs. Wilson. Mr. Stafford wants his daughter Julie moved out of Mrs. Horton's classroom. What we need to know. So we need to know the state and district policies on evaluation and the state and district policies on teacher dismissal. We need to know if Mrs. Horton is willing to change her behavior to avoid losing her job, and how the parents are going to react to any actions of the principal, which in this case is me. The problem in this case is that Mrs. Horton is acting very inappropriately. Her behavior is unacceptable and unprofessional, and her actions need to be taken by the principal and Mrs. Horton in order to prevent further issues in the future. The second category is the proposed plan of action. So this is what I propose to do in the case. First, I would take care of the immediate needs of the situation. So the first need is to get Mrs. Horton removed from the classroom. So this meeting took place in the morning, so I'm assuming that means that there's going to be students entering this classroom soon. And we need to get Mrs. Horton out of the classroom because she's really angry, really upset, and not in a place where she can be put in charge of students right now. And arrange for someone else to cover Mrs. Horton's students so that they can come in, do their morning work, and complete their routine as usual. That might be a paraprofessional, a special education teacher, a specials teacher, since this is elementary school. But somebody needs to come in and watch Mrs. Horton's class so that she can go somewhere private and calm down. Step 2 would be to review the options and choose an action. So during this course of this case, I did a little bit of research. Most of it I already knew from the course of this, through learning through the course of this class. But if the principal didn't know these policies, they would need to research them. So I found that in Kansas, there's no tenure policy, which I've discussed in previous assignments. And in my school district, which is Kansas City, Kansas Public Schools, there's also no tenure policy. I used my school district's policies as an example since the case study has a made-up school district. Also, I wanted to talk about evaluation. So would this be part of Mrs. Horton's evaluation? All evaluation is noted in observation of instruction in our district, so this wouldn't necessarily fall under her evaluation. However, because there's no tenure policy, the superintendent can actually suspend or terminate any teacher for violation of district policies at any time. So I included 4 different policies that I felt like Mrs. Horton was in violation of here. So being available for parent-teacher conferences, conducting yourself in a professional and ethical way, and then bullying. If she's verbally abusing students, that's bullying students. So those are just 4 different policies that I felt like were in violation here. Step 3 would be to meet with Mrs. Horton. So after Mrs. Horton has had a chance to kind of calm down, I wouldn't want to meet with her the second that meeting ended, just because I think that she would be so amped up and angry that there would not be a potentially good outcome there. So I'd want to wait until she calmed down a little bit, so maybe an hour later or so, I would present her with 2 options. She can either work towards progressing in this situation, or we can proceed with termination. I realize that it sounds kind of extreme to just go straight to, do you want to get fired? But Mrs. Horton's classroom is currently not a place where any students can learn. It's this place where students feel anxious and they don't feel cared for. And so that's not an environment that I as a principal would allow to happen in my building. And so if Mrs. Horton is not going to make any steps towards progress, then she needs to be dismissed based on her breaking the rules of those policies, which I outlined in the previous slide. We also need to design a plan for progress. So if Mrs. Horton is going to decide, yeah, I'm going to try to progress, I'm going to try to get better, then this is what we're going to do. We're going to sit down together and we're going to design a plan for how that's going to look. First, Mrs. Horton is going to need to apologize to Mr. Stafford specifically, as well as any other parents who have made complaints. And then I think she should issue a general apology to all the students in her class. She also needs to apologize to all the staff members that she's been combative and argumentative with, and just really aggressive towards this year. I then would look at increasing the walkthrough observations conducted in Mrs. Horton's room. I realize that teachers sometimes view walkthrough observations as the principal checking in on them, and in this case, that's exactly what I would be doing. I want to check in and make sure that there is a learning community going on in Mrs. Horton's room. Is she teaching the standards? Is she teaching our new piloted curriculum? Is she verbally abusing a student? I just want to make sure that students are safe and students are able to learn in her classroom. I would also suggest to Mrs. Horton that maybe she consider going to therapy. Obviously, this is not something I can require her to do, but if her personal issues are affecting her professional life, then that would maybe be something she should consider. But again, I can't force her to do that. And then something I would definitely implement is I would have her meet with the principal on a weekly basis to discuss her progress. I want to discuss the results of those walkthrough observations and give feedback on them every single week. We talked about walkthrough observations in one of our modules for this course, and sometimes they're ineffective, but we also learned through an article written by Jane David that they can be effective as long as you're providing feedback with them. So I think they would be effective in this case because there would be feedback. And if Mrs. Horton is not making progress towards these goals, she's not creating a learning community, she's not having a better attitude towards her students and staff, then we would go with termination. If she just went straight to termination, then we would proceed with termination, or if she wasn't making progress, we would proceed with termination, and we would write the policy violations in her personnel file, and then contact a supervisor to arrange for a termination hearing, which is how it works in KCK. Step 5 would be parents. So after dealing with Mrs. Horton and creating that plan, I would contact parents who have issued complaints. I would ensure them that the situation is on my radar, I understand their concerns, and I am handling it. I would not share the specifics of the plan with them, just because I think that's between Mrs. Horton and I, but I would ensure them that there is a plan to ensure progress is being made, and to let me know if they have any future concerns. I would contact Mr. Stafford specifically, separately, and apologize on behalf of Mrs. Horton and the school. And then this is something I went kind of back and forth over. Should I move Julie out of the classroom? Should I not? I ended up deciding I'm not going to move Julie right away. The reason for that is if I move Julie, then I'm going to get a call from 12 other parents asking to move their kid out of Mrs. Horton's room. I can't move all of them, so I don't think it's fair to move one kid who has a strong parent who's willing to advocate for her. However, I would consider moving Julie in the future if Mrs. Horton made progress, but Julie was still having issues with Mrs. Horton just because of their past dynamic. I would consider moving her then. I would also offer meetings. I would also offer Mr. Stafford for Julie to meet with the counselor, and I would extend the same offer to any other students who were having issues. So talking about what is best for the students in Category 3. So there's some different ways that I felt like I made a plan that would benefit all students. So one, I met their immediate need for care and routine and consistency. I made sure that someone was supervising their class so that they could come into their classroom just like a normal morning and continue with normal things. I know their teacher wasn't in there, but I felt like that was what was best for them at that moment, was to not be in such an angry, charged environment. I am making I'm making efforts to improve their teachers' behavior. So this isn't just going to benefit one student who I'm going to remove from the class. So I'm not only moving students whose parent advocated for them, I'm making sure that all of the students in the class are benefiting by this teacher's improved behavior. And then I'm also offering counseling to students who need it, like Julie Stafford, but any other students who felt like they needed it or whose parents felt like they needed it as well. The next category is reflection. So this is going to talk about what I was thinking about during this case. So I was thinking about state and district policies that would be relevant to the case, thinking about what am I legally required and what am I legally able to do. And then I want to know what can I do to help Mrs. Horton and her students. So my primary concern here is helping these students, but I know that in order to help the students, I have to help Mrs. Horton. So what can I do to help the students through helping Mrs. Horton? And then what can I do to satisfy parent concerns? Concerned parents are the kind of parents that you want. You want parents who really care about their kids. That's good parenting. But what can I do to help parents know that I am taking this situation seriously and doing everything I can to benefit their students? My feelings in this case, I really, in general, felt sorry for the personal trouble Mrs. Horton was having. That's not something you want to see anyone go through, and while her behavior is not acceptable, I do feel bad for what she's going through. I also mostly feel sorry for the students in the classroom who are unable to learn and unable to be successful right now because of Mrs. Horton's behavior and the environment that she has created. And then I also feel like this issue should not have progressed this far. So obviously, I am the principal in this case, but Mrs. Wilson, the true principal, should have handled this issue when Mrs. Horton was being combative with staff members and the original parent complaints came through, rather than waiting until this escalated to this point. Finally, the things I'm valuing. Above all, I'm valuing the students in this case. They are the most important purpose of why we have school, so I'm valuing their learning and their well-being above everything else, which is why I was willing to fire an experienced teacher over this issue. I also, however, value the knowledge and experience Mrs. Horton possesses. She's a former Teacher of the Year in the district. Clearly, at some point in her teaching career, she was an amazing teacher, and I want an amazing teacher in my building. So if she has that capability still in her, I want that. I want to go back to that rather than firing her and potentially ending up with an inexperienced, unqualified, or maybe a long-term sub in the classroom instead. I also value parents who want the best outcomes for their children. Like I said, I value parents who are concerned about their children's well-being, and I want to assure them that I'm doing everything I can to help them. And then I also value my reputation as a principal and the reputation of my school. I don't want a reputation as a principal of being someone who does nothing to help students. I don't want people to think that students being bullied is acceptable at my school. So I want to do everything I can to correct this situation. There's a lot of potential here for unresolved issues in this case. So what is Mrs. Horton going to choose? Is she going to choose progress, or is she going to choose to just walk away from the job? And then if she chooses progress, is she going to adhere to the plan? Is she going to make efforts? Is she going to progress? If she does choose termination, is that going to result in lawsuits? Is she going to try to get a wrongful termination suit going? Will the parents accept this decision? If I was a parent, I'm going to be honest, I don't know that I would fully accept this decision. But I think that as a principal, I also know that it's in the best interest of all students. So I would definitely think that an unresolved issue in this case is going to be parent reaction. And then also student reaction. So how are the students going to react to this? Are they still going to be afraid of Mrs. Horton for the remainder of the year? Are they going to be able to move past this and start learning from her again? Obviously, they're very, very young students, which I think in some sense is a benefit. Maybe younger students are more forgiving, but younger students also are easier to scare. They're more anxiety prone sometimes. So sometimes we just never really know how that young of students will react. And finally, my connection to the standard. So standard 2 is about instructional capacity, providing academic success and emotional support to all students. So promoting academic success, I promoted academic success by ensuring the immediate continuation of learning by replacing Mrs. Horton in the classroom immediately. Attempting to retain this former Teacher of the Year. Like I said, I want her in my building if she can be a good teacher again. And then conducting walkthroughs and meetings to make sure students are learning in my building. Secondly, emotional well-being. I didn't want to expose students to an out-of-control situation, which is why I removed Mrs. Horton after the meeting. I'm also attempting to make progress to a more calm learning environment that supports the needs of all students. I'm also agreeing to remove a teacher if she doesn't make progress. So if students are being harmed here, she's not making progress, she's getting removed. And then finally, I'm considering moving select students if there's progress with Mrs. Horton, but some students are still struggling. And then finally, enhancing instructional capacity. I want to reestablish a community for learning in this room. Right now, there's no community for learning in Mrs. Horton's room. No one's learning because no one feels like safe. So I want to reestablish that community. I want to observe and meet regularly with the teacher in question to help her improve her teaching and continually grow professionally. And I am also going to mention a minor element of this case was using a new curriculum designed to help students in the school also improve the instructional capacity of the building. The references that I've laid out on this slide, the first one is just information about Kansas tenure. The second is what I mentioned during my talk here about classroom walkthroughs, which we used during a module in class. And then finally, the third is the board policies, which I use as an example. All right, so that's it. Thank you so much for watching.